We'll join the general
Oh,
and get moved over.
some of us are
Yeah,
starting. Yeah.
that's what I said.
Okay, so we are now recording.
Okay. Good evening, Paul Sellier, Water Resources Director. Welcome to tonight. Is I think the 7th board working session we've had on this topic. Starting, I think we started off back earlier in this year. Let's just leave it there. Too long ago to remember. A lot of things have happened since then. Not the least of which was the passing of Queen Elizabeth. Just to make note of that, there's been not a huge amount of it is going to affect us in our water supply assessment, but it's sort of an epic moment in history, and maybe we'll sort of achieve our own epic moment in history at the conclusion of this assessment at some point. So tonight's working session, our focus really is on the water supply, water management alternatives, as we're calling them. And specifically, a fairly simple sort of focus on the cost and the yield. And those are, kind of important parameters as we think of how these supplies will perform for us. So as we start thinking about evaluation of these alternatives, performance and how they perform in terms of resolving a shortage or deficit in terms of water is kind of a key component, along with cost. And so we spent the last, several weeks sort of finalizing the details and developing some additional details, which on a couple of these, which we haven't yet had the opportunity to share with you. And we will do so in a little bit more detail, perhaps at the next regular board meeting. I'm thinking specifically of the brackish water desal up in Petaluma, and a couple of the other options that we've had now the opportunity to flesh out a little more. But tonight we're presenting you sort of the yield and cost of those alternatives. And you'll note that the slide deck is quite lengthy, but happy to report that we'll be going through just the first 30 slides, and the remaining slides are there as to provide detail to both the board and the public in terms of the water management alternatives. And of course, if there are any questions on any of those, we're happy to address those tonight. So without much further ado from me, I'd like to pass it over to Armin and his team to take us through the slide deck.
Paul, can I interrupt for just a second? I think we should probably do a roll call to take
process. Yeah.
Carrie, did you
Director, yeah, sorry, I had to unmute. Director Bregman.
Here.
Director Gibson.
Here.
Director Schmidt.
Here.
And President Russell.
Here.
Thank you.
Okay, I've got the PowerPoint up here, actually. Can folks see that okay?
It's good.
Okay. So over to you, Armin. I'll let you take it away from here.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, Paul was just going to say maybe I can share, and
yeah, up to you if you prefer to.
It'll go a little quicker that way, I think.
Okay.
Okay, well, good evening. Paul, thank you for the nice setup for what we're trying to cover today. Again, I'm Armin Manever from Jacobs, and I have some of my colleagues on the line with us here should we need to go into some more detail. So Marcelo Reginato, Jim Logier, and Rujiro Tsushihashi are on the line if we need to dive into detail, but we're intending to stay at a fairly high level for what we want to talk about today. This is really meant to be a summary of where we're at. So what we'd like to walk through is just a brief project update, what we've been up to, and then a focus on the summary of the water management alternatives, and then a very brief kind of lead into where we're heading next with the evaluation process. So give you a peek into the next steps as well. Today's the 13th. What we're focusing on today is the summary of the water management alternatives. We have, I believe this one's scheduled the 27th or will be scheduled. The intent for that meeting is to go through an evaluation of the water management alternatives that we've begun, but not yet completed. And then we'd be working towards kind of both a public workshop to share more of the information. And then where we're heading longer term is the draft, how we get towards draft portfolios, which are combinations of various alternatives and strategies around them. And then finally getting towards some recommended roadmaps that we would be proposing and working with the board to develop. But today is really about, the focus of today is really what I've been saying is we're putting all the cards on the table. So all of the water management alternatives are going to be presented at a high level. We've applied no judgment to those alternatives other than an assessment of the yield and cost of them. So we're at the stage where the alternatives have been described, have done some technical analysis, we've done some costing, but we've not yet applied another suite of criteria to them, which would be our next step where we start to apply other screening criteria. So just as a, oops, that animation got a little weird. Just as a milestone of where we are, or a marker where we are in the process, we've talked about early on, we talked about the strategy and goals. We've talked a little bit about the decision support model, which has been advanced. We went through scenarios where we looked at various hydrologic conditions where we were characterizing the potential risk under drought. And then where we've been focusing probably the good past couple months on is really full development of these water supply alternatives. And then, as I mentioned, the next step here is to get to evaluation of those alternatives. And they should say water management alternatives, since we kind of brought all the conservation or the demand management pieces into the same framework. So that's where we are and where we're heading. Just graphically to show where we are in the process. You know, at the very bottom of this graphic is getting towards a roadmap, resilient, sustainable water management roadmap. We've been looking at considering a broad range of alternatives that largely are the top part of this graphic, things that increase supply, manage demand, other policy and operational aspects. And then we will be heading towards an evaluation of them, which will look something like this measles chart of red, yellow, green, where we have a set of criteria where we'll be applying to each of those. And then we're realizing there's probably not a silver bullet that will resolve and we almost are certain it's not going to be a silver bullet that will resolve your drought resiliency. It's going to be a portfolio approach. And so we'll use both kind of the assessment of the alternatives and the evaluation of them to develop a set of portfolios with the board input, and then evaluate how those portfolios perform in achieving long-term and drought resilience. So that's where we are at the top of this graphic. Let's see. Okay, so what we wanted to walk through today is these are the categories of water management alternatives that we've been considering. The first one is the baseline. It's the existing water supply system. So our starting point is essentially your system as of today. It includes your investments that you've made in Castagna, et cetera. So those all essentially become part of the baseline. We'll talk about the water conservation alternatives that were discussed at your last week's board meeting on the 6th. We have a category of alternatives that are Sonoma Marin partnerships, essentially how to achieve reliability through different options with Sonoma Water and the Russian River supply. We'll look at local surface storage. We've done some further work on evaluating both increases in existing surface storage and future new storage, potential future new storage. The water purchases with conveyance through the Bay interties. I think we've shared most of that with you. And then we have a range of desalination and recycled water alternatives. And so the intent for the next set of slides is we'll walk through just a high level summary of what we've considered and then share the yield and cost associated with each one of them. Like Paul mentioned, in the back of your slide deck is a whole section on supplemental information, which goes into each of the alternatives in a little bit more detail. It's not the gory detail that you may want, but it's another level of detail. And we'd be happy to talk about that today or at the next board meeting that Paul was mentioning. Okay, so maybe just a quick summary of the assumptions and estimates. So a little bit of caveats here on all of the alternatives. So all of the alternatives have been kind of different levels of development of each of the alternatives. We started off with a review of previous studies, particularly the 2040, the Water Resources Plan 2040, but also some additional work done by the district and others. We've used a lot of our technical experience of our team. We've done some high-level independent technical evaluations, and then kind of high-level, concept-level routing and sizing for our conveyance. Everything we identify here, we kind of conceptual level analysis. We have done some preliminary modeling of some of the alternatives in order to estimate the yield. Some of them are not as straightforward, like when you add new storage or you tie into a new conveyance from the Russian River system. You can't just put a number on that without doing some modeling work. So we've done some modeling work to get to the early estimates. And then where we're heading with this is to build all of them into the system so that we understand how they integrate and their actual ability to reduce the drought risk. And then the cost assumptions, we're describing them all as essentially class 5, which is conceptual level cost estimates. We've got capital and O&M costs that we'll share. And then we've got, all of them were done over 30-year planning periods, unless the infrastructure lifespan was less than that. And then again, a number of them were done at different levels of evaluation. So we've done, for some of the alternatives, we've done independent evaluation using our Jacobs cost estimating tools. I'd say only a few of them were done at that level, primarily the desalination and the water reuse options. Many of them were updated estimates based on previous cost estimating that were escalated for 2022 conditions. And then finally, kind of at the courses level, we've done cost comparisons to related projects where we haven't done kind of full engineering calculations. So just to keep that in mind as we go through the assessment. So the very first one I wanted to walk through, and as we go through each of the yields, just another thing to keep in mind is all of them are being shown as if they're independent concepts. So we've not done any integration of the concepts. For example, we haven't tried to take the Sonoma water ones with an increased storage or a desalination or reuse with the additional storage. So they're all independent at this point, and we'll be looking to combine promising ones in the next step. Now, the water conservation, they're the two. This is what was presented to you, to the board last Tuesday. Carrie and Paul had presented this. There were two options there, kind of different levels of investment, the existing or the expansion of the existing water conservation program, and then a regulatory driven program. And my understanding is there may be some additional review will be underway, and if that discloses or identifies any need to change or expand that, we'll incorporate that into this analysis as we move forward.
So Armin, if I could briefly.
Yes.
Can you explain, as I understand it, we're using the conservation numbers in option one in terms of understanding the yield, understanding the supply deficit. And the idea is, were the review to change those numbers, we'd be able to tweak the spreadsheets and reflect those changes, but we do need as a baseline for demand management. So we are using that for now as a placeholder, and if it changes, we'll adapt. Did I characterize that correctly?
Yeah, that's right. So we're starting off with essentially kind of today's level of demand, and then the very first step we do after that is build in that option one, which you're right, Ben, the water conservation program is built into the modeling immediately after the baseline. So, and yeah, and if that gets expanded or modified, we'd be able to modify the modeling, no problem. So we're flexible and can adapt to this. This is not the most complicated in terms of the technical analysis to implement in terms of the water supply and system operations. I know it is complicated in terms of determining the yields and the programs and the level of depth you want to go to. But.
Can I ask a quick question? Ben, have we gotten a hold of Madaus?
Yes, we have we're got a meeting scheduled, or we're scheduling it for next week. We're in parallel developing the contract. So yeah, that'll get up and going very shortly.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Yeah.
Okay, well, as it stands now, what was presented last week was the two different options. Is option one, the water conservation project, and then a regulatory driven project. The yield numbers that were estimated by Marin staff were at 2045 were roughly 4,000 acre feet of potential demand reduction under option one, with a cost range of about $1,800 per acre foot associated with that project. The regulatory driven project, which expands upon option one and builds more conservation elements to it, would increase the total or reduce the demand by around 5,600 acre feet per year, and has a cost of over 4,000 or around $4,000 an acre foot.
Hey, Armin, I'd like to just ask a quick question about the regulatory driven project.
Mhm.
It seems to me it depends, and maybe, so forgive me, I haven't had a chance to review the full presentation that was just sent to the board, but is there it seems like there's a range of actions here that would, like banning a non-functional turf in commercial areas would have a certain, that's a regulatory action, I assume, that's included this would be similar to what would be included in this option.
Yes, yeah, that's correct.
So just taking that as an example, not that I'm promoting that per se, what would be the cost of to the district as per acre feet for doing that?
Yeah,
So,
I'm sorry.
yeah, so I think maybe you can get where I might be going, which is that it seems like there's a range of yield as well as a range of cost per acre foot. Is my sense, and it depends on how much and on how much staffing and enforcement or something like that. I'm not sure that that's necessarily always tied to, like, we have a lot of different regulatory requirements right now. Would we enforce more than we already currently do? So just a question about that.
Yeah, so to achieve the yields, we do believe we'll need additional resources and staffing, because, it's only as good. We're kind of talking about policies that require a measure of investment, but you're absolutely right. We haven't looked at each discrete activity banning non-functional turf for a point of sale program or those sorts of things individually. We could do that. The board may want to think about doing it as part of an expansion of a program that we are going to be doing. And we are going to look at whether it's gray water or non-functional turf or either even further out their programs, we're going to continue to talk to the board. So part of it is how much do we want to do now and make decisions to bump up the 4,000 acre feet, and how significant would that be in context of the numbers we're working with at this point? And I just want us to think about, we aren't saying we're either going to do one or two. We're saying, right, just in context of the water supply assessment, what subtraction do we want to do from our water supply deficit that we've modeled? Is 4,000 in the ballpark and we move forward? Do we want to go through each additional activity and go through the exercise and get another 200 acre feet here, 700 here, 100 here?
Ben, I just want to be clear. I know that. I don't want us to go back through old conversations because we've got a lot to go through. I was just looking to see the regulatory. I was had a question about the regulatory driven project, that there is probably a range of different actions and a range of different costs. And it would just
Absolutely.
I think that would be helpful. And some
Okay.
breakout of different assumptions so that people could just
Okay.
see what that means. Because I just the
No,
example I
I-
gave,
I-
I'm not
I-
sure why it would cost 4,000 an acre foot, but it
Yeah,
also
no,
won't
it's a
have that big of a
great-
yield either.
Yeah.
So anyway,
Yeah.
I think one thing to,
We'll bring that, just if I could on that one. Sorry, Armin. We'll take a look at that and probably bring that at a routine update for the board to see that breakout and what the yield and approximate cost would be of the individual, because it may be that the board wants non-functional turf put into. So yes, I hear you, and it's something that what we can definitely do.
I think one thing that's unique about the water conservation options is that they're ramped up over time, so that their yield grows as we go through time. Many of the other options, we're assuming once they're implemented, you're starting to see some of the yield from it. So I think part of the cost is associated with a ramping up of conservation over time. Okay, well, I'll keep moving along. Since I can't read everyone's face, I'll assume we're ready to move. The next category of options is the Sonoma, or of alternatives, is Sonoma Marin partnerships. And we have 5 options that are considered under this category. They start out with kind of the lowest hanging fruit, if you will, of maximizing use of Sonoma water with existing facilities. So this is an analysis where we've said that we're not changing any conveyance. We're just trying to maximize the use of that water and how much potential supply could be made available. Then we move into how could you get greater benefits from Sonoma water if you resolve some of the conveyance bottlenecks. We know we have limitations in the Petaluma Aqueduct, and we have limitations as we get into a Marin system. So if you were to resolve some of those, what's the maximum amount of water you could get during dry periods? And then the third kind of evolution of that maximized use of Sonoma water is looking at dedicated conveyance to Nicasio Reservoir. So now we're really looking at not just reducing bottlenecks, but being able to take Russian River water and put it into local reservoir storage. That's something you cannot do directly right now. It's all indirect, in which you would provide water and then hold off on releases from your local reservoirs. But this would be a physical put of water into the reservoirs. And then the fourth one is participating in the groundwater well rehabilitation efforts that Sonoma Water is embarking on. We've graded out for this particular presentation because it may be something that's already essentially baseline. Sonoma Water is actively doing a number of their wells here. So this may be something it's great for the broader Sonoma Water Regional delivery reliability, but it may not be a project that Marin could invest in directly for yield. And then the last one on this list here is the regional groundwater bank. So participating in regional groundwater bank with groundwater capability storage in both in Santa Rosa Plain, in Petaluma Valley, and Sonoma Valley. This would involve ASR, aquifer storage and recovery, so wells that could both recharge into the groundwater basin and extract from the groundwater basin, and they would be able to tie into the existing conveyance networks. The summary of these projects, and again, there's more detail in the supplement. The first one doesn't involve really any new capital investments. It's a bit of a policy perspective in that we as Marin would desire to take more water from Sonoma, even at the risk of potentially spilling that water. So all of the yield estimates that are shown here are assuming the yield that could be produced during the 4-year dry period. So there's more yield that could be produced on an annual basis outside in those wet years, but that ends up being water that's filled and spilled, and so there's not a net gain in it because you have enough local supply. So the first line there is maximizing with existing facilities, and there's about 1,500 acre-feet per year of new supply that could be gained at existing costs of Sonoma Water. The next option then, well, from that, we realized that we have conveyance limitations in limiting the amount of water that could be brought into Marin's system. And those conveyance limitations are both on the Petaluma Aqueduct, in particular, the Eli Booster station, and within your system at the Ignacio Pump Station. But if we were able to resolve some of that conveyance, there'd be a capital cost investment, which is looking at additional conveyance. There's about 2,500 acre-feet of dry year yield that could be made available. And then you can see the cost range there is about double of what you're paying now, but relatively lower price as we compare to some of the other alternatives. The third one on this table is looking at combining the first 1 and 2, but with dedicated conveyance to storage. And we've looked at a number of options where we are taking water either through existing conveyance and extending that conveyance to Nicasio Reservoir, or building new conveyance altogether. There's about 4,000 acre-feet per year of potential yield that could be gained through combining the maximizing take of Sonoma Water with a dedicated conveyance to local reservoirs.
Armin, is that conveying raw water or is that treated water?
In this case, for the number 3, this would be conveying Sonoma Water, which would be treated water, but you would be putting it into your raw water reservoirs.
And then it would be retreated by
Yeah.
us.
Yeah.
So we would be doubling our treatment costs,
Mhm.
essentially.
Is that built in the numbers, the dollar numbers?
It's built in terms of the amount of cost to get the water into the reservoir, not additional cost of treating it. We're assuming that you would treat, if you didn't have this water, you'd have some other supply to treat. So we've not
Right.
done that as an additional element.
Right.
Yeah.
Right, but okay, so we would be getting treated water and putting it into the reservoir then.
Yeah, because
Well,
because the
water's
Sonoma
not,
Water Aqueduct is a treated water.
yeah, it's not really treated, Larry. I mean, it comes out of the rainy collectors, so it's just defined as it doesn't need treatment by the health department.
Got it,
So it never gets treated. It just is okay to drink as is.
got it.
That's primarily chlorinated and put into the aqueduct. That's a
Can
good
I ask a
question.
quick question, Armin, about these? Are these options, which are interesting, did they assume using the same infrastructure in places such that they're not, you couldn't just say, we're going to do 1, 3, and 4 and use these same assumptions because there's overlapping infrastructure?
Well, the 4 and 5 are not related to the, so they're not an accumulation of projects. So 4 and 5 are completely independent.
Yes.
1 is today's facilities. 2 and 3, there's some overlap there. So if you were to invest in the conveyance, then do dedicated capacity, you may not worry so much about the dedicated conveyance. So you might do 3 and not 2.
Yeah.
And the yield would still be the same as what's listed here. But there could be an option where you would resolve your bottlenecks in 2 and then do a smaller level of conveyance to storage and be on the lower end of these cost numbers.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's helpful to understand that we can't do these things necessarily, choosing multiple of these options because they're exclusive of each other in certain ways.
Yeah, so certainly 1, 2, and 3, you can't add those numbers up and look at yield. Number 4, which is grayed out, I won't spend much time. Again, it's the 3 Santa Rosa plain wells that Sonoma Water operates. They're doing a rehab on those wells, and they're gaining around 2 MGD or 2,000 acre feet per year of yield, and that's kind of restoring some of the yield that they used to have prior to the non-use of those wells. Again, that's probably going to fall in baseline, and we might just incorporate that as a baseline and not as a Marin option to be considered. The last one on the list here, again, is the regional groundwater bank. And this one is looking at around 20,000 acre feet of storage potential between the Santa Rosa, Petaluma Valley, and Sonoma Valley. We've assumed for this estimate that about 10,000 acre feet of that 20,000 acre feet that Marin could invest in as part of that as a dry year yield. The groundwater bank, from our assessments, fills up every year leading up to the drought, to our 4-year drought. So it would essentially be full, in which case 10,000 acre feet over 4 years is about 2,500 acre feet per year. So we assume that essentially a 50% participation in the bank by Marin and a 50% participation by other entities.
Armin, on the number 1, existing facilities, so the baseline includes the increase with Castania?
Yes, it does. Yeah.
So that was about 5,000 acre feet. Is that what that assumption is? An additional 5,000 acre feet per year?
Right. That's what Castania would get you in kind of a normal year. In the driest years, it's not quite that amount, but yes, it is in the baseline. So this would be an increment over and above Castania increment.
Okay, so that's 6,500 over what we were taking 2 years ago.
Yeah. And so this one, number 1, really is like a policy. We're assuming you have perfect foresight. The drought is coming. You want to take the water, and if you acted in that manner, you would be able to extract additional yield out of the system.
Right. And the risk is, if we're wrong, that we've wasted the water.
Correct.
On number 4, Sonoma has talked to us before, and maybe that train has left and it's no longer an option, but they've talked to us about partnering with them on those well rehabs. If we were to do that, wouldn't that add to the baseline? Wouldn't we get a greater take out of that and increase our above our baseline?
If I could, Armin, just maybe you can add what I forget. But I think Director Gibson, you're right. Initially, that was on the table, and then I believe Sonoma received considerable amount of grant funding for these wells. And so, for example, the Todd Road well, which is one of these, is already in service. And they're already actively pursuing the other two, which I think is a Sebastopol and Occidental.
Right.
So they're already pursuing those. And that's why we've kind of graded out. It seems like it's already happening.
Right.
A bit like our Castania project, which was, originally identified as a project, and now it's complete. So it doesn't make sense to list it.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, so I mean, if that changes, though, there's a delay in it that required a further investment or participation, there could be more conversations around that. But I think as it stands now, they're largely underway.
Mhm.
Okay, again, not reading the room, I'll keep going unless you want me to go backwards. So the next category of alternatives that we've looked at is local storage augmentation. And this is quite a bit of new work, so I'd encourage you to look at the supplemental packet after today's call, and glad to answer any questions on perhaps the next board meeting that Paul's talking about. We've kind of distilled them into three option aspects here. The first one is local surface storage enlargement. So could we augment either Suluhuli, Nicasio, or Kent Lake? Those are the three that we looked at that had the most promising characteristics. And then we looked at two kind of representative new surface storage options. So one on Devil's Gulch, and the second one being Halleck Reservoir location, or Halleck Creek. And so we've done some preliminary analysis on the potential dam heights and yields associated with that, and storage capacity, and how much new area would be inundated for each new 10,000 acre feet of new storage. That's what's shown on the graphic here. And if you look in the supplemental, it's a little bit easier to read, but the blue on the graphics to the right are existing reservoirs and inundation when the reservoir is full. The green represents a 10,000 acre feet enlargement. The yellow represents a 20,000 acre feet enlargement, and the red is a 30,000 acre feet enlargement. And obviously Devil's Gulch and the Halleck only show the 10, 20, and 30 because they're not existing reservoirs. And then finally, the third set of options, we're looking at adjustable spillway gates. We've done some updates to that work and cost estimates that I'll share on the next slide. The first one, like I mentioned, we've done quite a bit of detailed analysis on the Suluhuli, Nicasio, and Kent. For the purposes of this assessment, we've assumed an enlargement of one of those reservoirs up to 20,000 acre feet of new storage. This is about a 40 to 50 foot increase depending on which dam we're looking at. And that 20,000 acre feet, the yield estimates that we're seeing from the hydrology is that we could fill that reservoir and have it full preceding the dry periods. So that would be 20,000 acre feet of new supply that could be stored and operate towards increasing the reliability over the next 4-year dry period. So that's the 5,000 acre feet per year. And then the capital costs are for the enlargement. Those are largely taken from a review of both Los Vaqueros enlargement and San Vicente Dam enlargement here in San Diego. So these are relative costs. If we were to choose to move forward with this, we'd have to do more detailed cost estimates. But you can see the rough order of magnitude range of cost estimates that are shown here. For the new surface storage, the Devil's Gulch and the Halleck locations, these are actually not fantastic places for reservoirs. You'd need almost 180 feet dam in order to create 10,000 acre feet. So just as a comparison, you had about 40 to 50 feet of enlargement of dam height enlargement at Sulahuli, Nicasio, or Kent. If you were to build a new, it's not really off stream, but new storage, you'd need about 180 feet in order to create half that volume that we assume for Sulahuli, Nicasio, and Kent. And then the potential new supply there would be either from collecting local runoff or moving water directly from Nicasio or Kent into these new reservoirs. And then the costs for these, because they're new facilities, is quite large, and you can see the $4,000 to $6,000 an acre foot for new storage. And then finally, the third option here was looking at adjustable spillway gates. So we've updated the analysis here. We looked at adjustable spillway gates at all 4 of the reservoirs that were listed here. So Kent, Nicasio, Sulahuli, and Alpine. And there's roughly 5,200 acre feet of new storage that could be created by doing adjustable gates at all 4 of those reservoirs. And that could generate around 1,300 acre feet per year yield. The cost numbers have been reduced from what we've shown last time. They probably still get refined a little bit more before we call it final, but they have dropped substantially. They're not as low cost as what North Marin is showing because their dam configuration is quite unique. And I think also those numbers were perhaps a little low.
That, Armin, that's based on a 3-foot height.
Yeah, this is all based on 3 foot. I don't have the number on the top of my head, but if it went to 5 feet, I believe you get to 7,000 acre feet. And I have it. It should be in the back of the deck.
Yeah,
I'm looking for it.
so it's on card 62. So if we went to 5, then we're talking 61, 76. Looks like maybe 8,600 acre feet.
Yeah, close to between 8,000 and 9,000 acre feet could be generated. The numbers we simulated or we're reporting here are from the 3 foot, which is 5,270. So,
Okay.
Yeah.
And then it's divided by 4 to represent a 4-year synthetic drought.
Right. Non-synthetic drought, yes.
Or better known as worst case scenario.
Yes.
Would it be possible, Paul, to get a copy of the schematics of the gates at Kent, Nicasio, Sulahuli, and Alpine? He's muted, I think.
Sorry, yeah, I was saying brilliant things, not really. You mean the conceptual gates, Director Bragman, that we're proposing here, or?
Just
Or
we're
the
not-
current spillways.
Yeah,
Is that
the
what-
current spillway, so we would,
Oh, yeah. Oh,
we
yeah.
would have kind of a profile of
Yeah.
Oh,
what's there.
oh, absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, and I did, Director Bregman, have a good discussion. I met with Tony at North Marin last week to really begin to understand the concept of their project. And it is really a unique situation they have. They essentially have an old spillway and a new spillway. And by modifying the old one, which is what they're talking about, they increase storage, but it doesn't affect the actual spillway because they use their new spillway that was put in when they increased the size of the dam. So I don't yet fully understand it, but it is quite unique, and it gives them the ability to put this mechanized gate on a spillway, but still have their design spillway in effect. I just wanted to share the uniqueness of what they have, and really it's going to bear little relationship as Armin's team has found out on what we potentially can do.
Right, and that's why I'd like to see the schematic, just so
Yeah.
I can see
Yeah.
what we're dealing with.
Yeah.
Yep.
I think that would be helpful, and Paul, I can help you pull it together. I think the biggest thing is the size of the gate that would have to be implemented due to your reservoirs versus Stafford Lake, which are quite different.
Right. I think we'd have to do abutments, and yeah, it would be a more complex project, I think.
What's
But
what's
Could
the
I just
impact?
make a group? Oops. Just, I think as far as getting permission, regulatory permission, I think it would be a more acceptable approach, I think, for the State Water Board rather than raising the dams. So that's kind of my impression.
Yeah, I was gonna maybe add to that, which is I assume with number one, the assumption is that we have the same release requirements as what we have today. And that's, I think that's probably an assumption that we probably shouldn't make, or we should do very cautiously, because it seems like that might not be the case. The new surface storage, did you assume any release requirements for a water right?
No, at this point, we've not. Yeah, so
Okay. That
there would be enough supply. We did not assume that, so the answer is no at this point. But what we're conceptualizing here would be water would be placed into it from existing reservoirs, not just new yield that be generated by the local runoff.
it would be both.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I think again, just a part of the uncertainty around that.
Again, we're not trying to pass judgment yet on
No, I
it
know.
all, so I have my own opinions as well. So
Good.
trying to put all the cards on the table.
I don't mean to prejudge it. I think when we talk about what we expect from our yield, we just need to be mindful that we may be subject to release requirements as we currently are in our surface storage that could change that yield. And so I just think that that's an important part for folks to understand.
Right.
Or increased release, but maybe not. I mean, if they didn't increase the required release, then we would have some residual gain. So
We would have this is what that analysis would yield, is if there was no change in number one in terms of our required flow releases, then
Right.
this is what that yield would be. So, but but doing that would reopen and our water rights and things have often shifted in toward increasing flows in many cases.
Correct. Yeah. This is 20,000 acre feet essentially floating on top of your existing operations. That's the assumption. Okay, I'll keep moving. So the next group of alternatives or categories.
Oh, I'm sorry, Armin. I just, can we go back to Suluhui for just a second?
Sure.
And I'm sorry, everybody, I'm a little late. I'm afraid I'm at a water conference back east, so this was as soon as I could get here. I just wanted to check in with you, Armin. I don't know if you've seen some of this correspondence that we've gotten from a constituent in the area who's got concerns. So I'm just going to quote from her letter to the district. The proposed raising of Suluhui Dam does not make sense for the Hicks Valley region. Maps of the area show that the raised dam would flood the homes of long-timer and families, destroy their livelihoods, and would inundate valuable pasture land needed for their agricultural businesses. She's urging us to eliminate that proposal. It's a very polite letter, but I just wonder if you could speak to that.
Yeah, I've heard concerns. I don't know if I've seen that particular letter. So right now we're we're laying them all the cards on the table. The next step is essentially about identifying impacts and social and environmental aspects of it. Certainly inundation and impacts to local communities will be high on that list. So, that's when we'll get to which ones do we carry forward and which ones do we leave by the wayside.
Right. No, I totally understand that. I just wanted to be sure that you, and I think the other board members may have seen this letter, but I just hadn't seen a substantive response to it. So mainly I'm just asking at this point, does that seem like it's I mean, obviously, anytime you raise a dam, you're inundating something. So I'm just wondering if you've got, I mean, if it needs to wait till a later time, that's fine. But would you say that that's an accurate concern that there will be, given the level of raise that's being, I understand it's not being proposed, but it's being described that those kinds of impacts are reasonably likely.
Yeah, and we have a slide. It's 54 in the deck, which actually shows the increased dam height in order to generate amount of storage and the new inundated areas or new inundated area, both on a tabular form and then graphically on the following slide. So we have assessed that. We haven't done overlays of communities yet. That would be in our next process, but we've done kind of the physical characteristics. And yes, in order to get 20,000 acre feet, you're looking at, from 200 to 600 acres newly inundated, depending on which reservoir gets enlarged.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Does the estimate include acquisition of lands?
That was going to be my next question. Thank you, Monty.
That's a good point. It does not. It's only the physical dam infrastructure at this point.
But we would need to.
Yeah, I'll just, since I asked that question, I don't think that that's a reasonable assumption. I mean, that we would, of course, the cost of constructing it would absolutely have some sort of land acquisition cost.
Yeah.
I just don't think, I don't know if other things, when we look at the pipeline, we're looking at the cost of the infrastructure, all of it. I think that really, to keep these things, honestly, apples to apples, the cost of it is something we would have to acquire as part of it. Should really be in there.
Yeah.
Yeah, I really agree. I mean, this is the one letter we received on that. So, and it doesn't seem that it's received a lot of attention. So I just think it's important.
We've received more than one letter on it. We have another letter from the Ag Commissioner that expressed the same concern. So
yeah.
Okay.
we've had several letters about that for sure.
Okay, well, my only point is, I just want to make sure that it's being raised at this early date. We don't, and that the public is aware that we have seen that correspondence, that the board is considering it and is concerned about it. And to Monty's point, I really agree. I think, and I understand your point, Armin, that we're not there yet, but nevertheless, I think it is important that the cost estimates that we're showing to the public are comprehensive and do include, those, making those landowners whole and what that realistically entails. Because I don't think it's just the cost of acquiring a land. I mean, this is long-term, economic value. It's not just, we're buying the land.
Yeah, I don't mean to mean acquiring the land is the only aspect of the acquisition.
Right.
Their businesses, there's infrastructure. And other things that would have to be taken into consideration. Armin, I know that that's a big, wide unknown, perhaps, but I do think that, again, because we're not making a decision here, but we are trying to get costs per yield. I just think we have to have something in there that captures at least a range of what that would be, because it is part of the cost. It's not a decision, but it's just something we do need to know, I think.
Yeah, it's a very good point. We'll look into the cost estimates that we've used are essentially representative costs from existing reservoir enlargements. So I don't know if any of those included the land acquisition or land compensation aspects, but we'll be able to go back and look at that and make sure it's inclusive.
That would be great. Thanks.
Okay, are we good to move to the next one? Okay, the next group of alternatives are water purchases. So these are largely Sacramento Valley water purchases with conveyance through different routes, different interties. So we have water purchases that would come through an East Bay Mud intertie over the San Rafael Bridge, or an intertie directly to Contra Costa Water District using kind of the same supply that would be purchased in the Sacramento Valley. We looked at a third one, which is North Bay Aqueduct intertie, state water project contractor that delivers water to Napa, and then an extension of that aqueduct or an intertie from there to the Petaluma and Sonoma aqueducts is considered under number 3. And then finally, we have a small but important intertie of over the Golden Gate Bridge from PUC. So trying to intertie and deliver water primarily to the southernmost portions of your district. So not a full supply to your district.
Armin, just to clarify, when you say water purchases, are you talking about leases or are you talking about purchases of water rights for the long term?
So what we've evaluated here is temporary purchases. So one year transfers.
Got it. Is there a possibility of considering, essentially outright purchases of land and associated water rights? It's just something that's been brought forward a few times to me now, and that some of us have raised at the last few but we've been raising it the last couple of meetings.
Yeah, could certainly consider that. We did not at this point, primarily because that would involve you buying into, or Marin buying into, being a manager of water in the Bay Delta system on a long-term basis. And that's a larger program than a single year purchase program.
Exactly. Yeah.
So there's that. Yeah, that's why we've not considered it to date. So
Okay.
depending on where the board wants to go, we can expand, but currently we're looking at a temporary 1-year transfer.
Got it. So just to be super clear, when we talk about water purchases, what we're talking about here are 1-year leases, not actual purchases of rights.
Correct.
Thanks.
Yeah, and I have that's my footnote on the next one here. So I went back and looked through the last 15 years of water transfers out of the Sacramento Valley, and looked at kind of the magnitude and trying to determine kind of the bounds on this particular assessment. East Bay Mud and Contra Costa have about a 10,000 acre-feet transfer program that they signed with Yuba County Water Agency last year in 2021. So I assumed, as part of this analysis, a maximum of 20,000 acre-feet on a temporary transfer, and that would be supplied over a 4-year program, or a 4-year period. So it'd be a single year temporary transfer, but I spread it out over 4 years in terms of looking at the potential yield aspects.
And what about the San Francisco PUC? What's the limitation there of 1,000 acre feet?
Yeah, two limitations. One is conveyance. It's small pipelines. We're talking about 12 and 18-inch pipelines. And then you're delivering water at your southernmost end of your system. So you can only really supply to a relatively small zone. So both conveyance and the amount of demand you can be delivering towards. Those are the limitations on the 1,000 acre feet.
This is a new. Sorry, go ahead, Jack.
Presumably no storage on that 1,000 acre feet.
Again, we didn't combine any of these with storage yet.
Okay.
But certainly if we were to move forward with either the interties or Sonoma water, greater use of Sonoma water, storage definitely provides a lot of value in taking that wet year or wetter year water and using it in a dry year.
Right.
I think this one in particular is challenging if you're in the critically dry year market. You've got a lot of other parties who are playing in that same market, big water players that can drive up the cost. If you could combine it with storage, then you could potentially be buying outside of that critical year market, and it would reduce your cost to participate.
So you're sort of making my point. I mean, I think that's a really important point, Armin. So thank you for bringing that forward. And I know you haven't analyzed this yet, so I don't want to put you on the spot with an unfair question, but it does raise the issue about whether we would be in a stronger position if we simply bought, some level of water rights outright. Then we wouldn't really be competing. They would simply be our rights. And we could either use them in the years that we need them, or we could actually sell to others and bring in income in years when we don't need them. I know that's simplistic, but is that a fair way to put it?
it would certainly make your yield available in many of the years. With comes along with that, though, are a lot of additional costs and aspects that I'm sure you're quite aware of.
Yeah.
So it's a bit of a trade-off on how much you want to become a Bay Delta participant versus a purchase agreement entity.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I agree.
And you would also be subject to the limitations imposed by the State Water Board.
You'd be subject to those leasing anyway.
Right, but I'm just saying you would, there were severe limitations this past year, so it's not, unlimited just because you bought the rights.
It's not unlimited, but there's a
sub-
difference between being a contractor and being a water rights holder. So that's, I mean,
Right.
that's, those are
Both
significant.
both are subject to regulation year to year.
But there's a very big difference between being a water rights holder and being a contract holder. You're not subject to allocations. It's, so yeah, I'm not saying we should do it. I'm just saying it provides a level of certainty that being in the open market does not.
I don't know how we would, I mean, I think you're raising an interesting point, Director Kohler, in terms of different strategies. I just wonder how we can, whether there's a way to show that in a way that we can be mindful of the difference. Because one is, the acquisition of a water right is a long-term piece of security, and it is definitely happening out there in the water world, of agencies acquiring water rights. So it would be interesting just to see the numbers. Again, not saying it's a good idea, but
yeah, and I'm not saying it's necessarily a good idea. It's been raised, and Director Schmidt, I want to be super mindful of your situation, because the idea that was presented to me was from colleagues at your organization. So I want to be, careful about, the role that you would play in any decision on that, if it comes to that. But just the options that have been raised seem very intriguing. And just separately, I was going to suggest that we get a presentation from the folks who are working on these issues at TNC, because the folks who presented it to me were pretty gung ho about the possibilities.
I'm not involved in that. So
I know. I just want to be transparent. That's all.
Yep. Thank you. Yeah, always. The SFPUC intertie, it's the first time I've seen that as an option. It's surprising. I'm surprised that honestly the cost and the annual, especially the O&M, the idea of a pipeline across the Golden Gate, that seems, I mean, just in so many different ways, that seems so much more complicated than a pipe across the Richmond Bridge.
Yeah.
But anyway, has this been looked at before, or is there, I mean, O&M, it seems like never ends on the Golden Gate Bridge. It's hard to believe that our O&M costs maybe would be so low compared to the O&M costs to East Bay Mud. I know there's something about size of the amount of water that changes, obviously, the O&M factor too, but I wonder if you could speak to that.
Yeah, so this was brought up several months ago, I think, at one of the board meetings or one of our initial sessions. So this is, as far as I know, this is the first look at it from our standpoint. We didn't rely upon past work for this, so it was very conceptual. We tied into the PUC system across the Golden Gate Bridge. It's a shorter length than a pipeline than the San Rafael Bridge, but you're at kind of the back end of both systems, which you're at the back end of PUC system and you're at the back end of Marin system. So it's kind of tying in the bottom ends of both systems. The cost estimates they were characterized as the same kind of unit cost as going over the San Rafael Bridge. So we did not escalate it for Golden Gate. So those certainly could change. I think there's a lot of unknowns in terms of Caltrans and historic site preservation aspects that we just at this point really don't know. And so we probably wouldn't do further looks at this until there was some indication that it's going to be on the table to investigate further.
There are some, once we get into the criteria and assessment, that there are some of these that are going to naturally drop out. For example, this one, I think we'll find when we look at the time factor to do anything on the Golden Gate Bridge, could, and we'll have to see, but could just have this one fall off the table to go through the bridge district and the time and effort with such a low yield, given our constraints. So as Armin said, by design, this is just all the options with yield and cost. But some of these, I think, as we go through it, there'll be a lot of red in the criteria assessment that will naturally kind of start winnowing this down a bit.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. I agree with that. Okay, I'll keep us moving to the next set of options are the desalination options. There are four alternatives. There are four options that we've, I believe, talked about with the board at previous meetings, all of them except for the number 4, which we've done some further investigation. So I'll just go through each of them very briefly. The first one is a Marin Regional desalination facility. So this is a facility located at the Pelican Way site. We've looked at 5, 10, and 15 MGD plant sizes. The second one, and one of these would discharge through the existing CSMA outfall, so the brine would be discharged. The second one is looking at the same site at a 5.4 MGD facility, but using a containerized system, so a pre-built system that would be hauled in and placed and put together, constructed at, in the location. The third one is the Bay Area Regional Desalination Facility, and this is looking at Mallard Slough, which is kind of at the edge of the delta, and so more of a brackish water diversion and desalination facility that East Bay Mud, Contra Costa, PUC, Valley Water, and Zone 7 have been participating to further study. We've assumed that Marin would buy in at a 5 MGD partnership capacity in that regional plant. And then the last one is the Petaluma Brackish Desalination Facility. So again, this was brought up by a number of folks leading into this study, but there's not been previous study on it. So we've done a very high level conceptual assessment. We have 6 wells that would be located on the east side of the Petaluma River, about 3 miles south of the city of Petaluma, which would pump brackish groundwater, which would then be treated through an RO system and then put on a pipeline across the Petaluma River to tie into the Petaluma Aqueduct. The concentrate would be discharged into the Petaluma River, either through kind of year-round discharge or through storage ponds that would have to hold water until winter or wet season discharge. So this is a more busy table just because of the variants that we've considered here. Again, for the Marin Regional Desal, we have the 5, 10, and 15 MGD sizes. You can see the yields and the costs associated with them. There is a 5 MGD standalone. So all of the 5 and the 10 MGD expandable ones were built to basically to be expanded by another 5 MGD. So 5 could go to 10 and 10 could go to 15. The first one listed there is a standalone, so a non-expandable version. All of the yield estimates were reduced from the nominal kind of nameplate capacity to annual yields by considering about 85 to 95% on the design capacities, depending on which facility. The containerized facility is located there, the number 2. And so you can see cost for the standalone facility is just under 5,000 an acre foot. And then as you go up to 15 MGD, you're getting economies of scale, and you're at $3,100 to $3,300 per acre foot. The containerized facility is pre-manufactured off-site, so there are cost savings associated with that facility. There's also challenges with that facility that will be teased out a little bit later. The Bay Area Regional Desal facility is the partnership. And then the Petaluma brackish groundwater, again, we've made the assumptions of the RO treatment and the discharge, and the range that's there is essentially whether we need to build storage ponds to hold that concentrate to discharge in wet season, or whether we can discharge continuously.
And Armin, are there water rights issues for the Petaluma facility? I mean, who owns that groundwater? Is that Petaluma? Is that Sonoma Water? Is that North Marin?
Yeah, so that would be all covered in the groundwater sustainability plan. So you bring in a lot of parties, the overlying owners, overlying landowners, as well as cities of Petaluma. This would very likely have to be a regional program. And yes, there would be water rights from the context of fitting in within the sustainability management plan. Yeah, so we've not done kind of that detailed investigation. This is kind of our first pass at taking an idea and moving it into a concept and putting some numbers to it.
The capital costs are pretty interesting. Significantly less than some of the other desal plans.
Yeah. I mean, this is brackish groundwater, so it's less than 1,000 TDS, milligram per liter TDS. So it's lower treatment, and it's 5 wells. It's not a full intake system, so, or 6 wells, sorry. So kind of similar prices, their cost estimates that you would see in some of the kind of inland empire type of brackish desal, that groundwater desal that occurs in Southern California.
And so is there any calculus or calculations of shutting these down when you don't need them?
Yeah, certainly for all of them, they could be shut down. The rapidity at which you could get it back up and running is, depends on the complexity of the plans, but certainly the brackish groundwater is a type of option that is not always run full-time 24/7, 365.
So it's got a little more flexibility than your standard desal operation.
Yeah, and I don't know if Jim Logier is on the line, if you wanted to weigh in on that, Jim.
Agreed. So the assumption we made under option 4 is that we have a fairly simple plant design. Groundwater, typically we have a very simple pretreatment system. That's an assumption again we're making here, not really having sufficient water quality to know one way or the other. But brackish groundwater plant, we basically pump from the wells directly through cartridge filters. We had a chemical for scale control. We go through a multiple stage brackish system and high recovery. We assumed 85% recovery here. So really the RO trains are pretty much the heart of the system. And so stopping and starting that system is fairly simple compared to a seawater desal facility where we have an intake system. We have a more complicated pretreatment system and a seawater system. So as Armin has indicated, that brackish groundwater facility for 4 would be the simplest to start and stop. The Bay Area Regional Facility does have extensive pretreatment because, again, it's a surface water supply. So we have to do a lot more filtration in order to deal with foulants in that supply. So it would be more similar to starting and stopping 1 or 2 in that regard.
So on the brackish groundwater facility, Armin mentioned that similar facilities are used in the Inland Empire. That's down south, right?
Yeah, so there's plants. Eastern Municipal Water District has 2 and now 3 desalters that essentially treat brackish groundwater. I mean, most of those facilities, are drinking water facilities, and they're there to provide firm capacity, so they're not taking those offline. Most desal facilities do operate, brackish groundwater, other facilities do operate all the time unless there's needs to shut them down, maintenance wise or other. Starting and stopping most of those facilities doesn't occur. I know Eastern has had to shut their facility down because they've had some issues with scaling in their brine line, because these facilities have a long pipeline to take their concentrate or brine to the ocean. And they often have scaling issues in that brine line. So they have to shut down periodically in order to clean that line out. But other than that, these facilities generally operate all the time.
And do they operate all the time at full capacity, or can you sort of reduce production depending on what your need is?
Yeah, with RO plant, the RO trains generally, you don't have much flexibility on how much you can turn up or turn down. What you would do then, if you have multiple trains, you would rotate the trains. So you might run one train for a while and then rotate that with another train maybe every couple of days. You don't want to have any trains offline more than, at worst case, a week or so, because then you have to get into a preservation mode, and that's much more complicated.
To preserve the
to preserve the membranes from
the membrane.
biological fouling. So you would just basically rotate the trains. Obviously, there's some flushing that occurs, and that flushing water either becomes wastewater, so to speak, that would end up going down the brine pipeline. So there's no free lunch, but certainly you can do that relatively easily.
Okay, thank you.
Jim, you use the word preservation. I use the word poison. I mean, you have to kill the bacteria.
Well,
So-
generally, we generally don't talk about it as a kill situation. We talk about it as a biostatic situation where we're trying to prevent growth, right? Because we don't want growth to occur anyway. It's hard to control it once it stops. So it's ideally you shut down and you hit it with sodium bisulfite, which is the typical chemical as a biostat.
Sure.
And
Sure.
then you renew that at some point if you have it offline for more than a month or so.
Yeah, the key thing, Larry, is you can't use oxidizing biocides like chlorine because it attacks the membrane. So you have to use reducing material like bisulfite or something like that, or an actual poison to get these guys without doing oxidation of the membranes.
Yeah. You can use non-oxidizing biocides, but they're usually not approved for drinking water, so they're only used in industrial facilities.
Exactly.
I think this option, the number 4 here, the Petaluma brackish, there's 2 major uncertainties. I'd say first off is, right, this is a first take at it and a conceptual. We're not sure if the yield that we've estimated here, 5 MGD, is actually capable of being extracted from the groundwater basin without impacts to adjacent users. So that there would have to be some groundwater modeling. And then the concentrate discharge, there's lots of uncertainty on how that would be discharged back to Petaluma River. There is an existing wastewater discharge that's not far from this location, but we've not yet had conversations or tried to tie into that.
The Ellis Creek wastewater treatment plant does discharge to the river in close proximity to where we've located this plant, but they cannot discharge between October the 20th and I think May 1st. I can't remember the dates exactly, but essentially a 6-month period where they're either discharged. I get them a 6-month period where they can discharge in the winter, but not this summer.
Yeah.
Now that's effluent. Effluent, obviously, which has different contaminants in it that we have with the concentrate from a well water supply. So whether an NPS permit discharge would be viewed the same for a concentrate versus an effluent, we don't know. That would be the key question to determine.
I don't think it will be. Las Colinas is faced with the same discharge limitations. And it makes their life pretty difficult, which would also be the case here. When we need the water, you can't discharge the brine, more than likely. Not impossible, but it's an issue.
Yeah, and that's why the cost range is relatively large, because we basically captured the cost to store that concentrate
I'm also
ponds
really
are-
concerned. I'm also really concerned about the hydrogeology of being able to suck through those fines. You're basically taking water out of a mud flat, and maybe, you know, I don't know. It's a big alluvial plain, and with a lot of mud.
Yeah, the units there are pretty tight grained material. So that's why I said, there's lots of uncertainties. This is very conceptual. If the district decides to move forward, the very first thing here is do that hydrogeological study and do some initial modeling to determine availability of supply. It may not be the 5 MGD that we've assumed.
And Armin, what about just returning some of the wastewater back into the ground rather than discharging it into the environment? Is that done?
Not typically in these systems. I mean, in the whole Inland Empire, Eastern, they've developed a brine line, which runs 50 miles or so, 30 miles or so, just to discharge that brine. So generally, you don't want accumulation of salts in the same area that you're extracting it from.
We generally have aquifer protection permits that limit that. And in some cases, if you're inland, a lot of power plants will put in evaporation ponds. We're not talking about evaporating the water here. We're talking about storing it. But yes, when you're inland and you don't have the easy access to a surface discharge, concentrate disposal becomes in some cases, the tail that wags the dog, cost-wise.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say, Armin, that they inherited a brine line from Kaiser Steel.
Yeah.
And, it was rammed through during World War II to run from Fontana all the way down to the Orange County sanitation locations, about 60 miles. It is a very valuable resource to the Inland Empire because it gives them a way to get rid of salt to the ocean that normally you wouldn't have, because the cost of that kind of construction is just, I mean, in that case, the steel mill was put inland so that they couldn't be easily bombed by the Japanese. That was their thinking, but it was a terrible location for a steel mill, having worked there a lot.
Right.
But you mentioned, Jim, there is a treatment plant in the vicinity that might be coupled with this project.
Yeah, Petaluma has the Ellis Creek wastewater treatment plant that does, as Armin indicated, does discharge to the river their effluent in the period, 6-month period. They can do that in winter time, and then they store it. In many cases, they reuse all that effluent anyway, so they don't really discharge in a lot of cases. But obviously, in the winter, when they have excess effluent, they would go to the river. So I don't know whether you could look at a combined discharge or not, where similar, so to speak, to what we're talking about with CMSA, but a totally different scenario with effluent there versus our brackish water, which obviously the TDS of the brackish water from this facility, as opposed to being 50 or 60,000 milligrams per liter, would be only 6,000 milligrams per liter. So it's a much lower salinity from a brackish plant starting with 1,000 or less TDS, depending upon what recovery we actually run the RO plant on. And if we could get a discharge permit, but we had to store part of the year, then you would try to maximize that recovery in order to minimize the size of those storage ponds. And that's an optimization exercise that we typically look at for situations like this, but in many cases it may require a pilot test.
Sounds pretty interesting.
Okay, well, thanks, Jim. Appreciate it. I'm going to keep us going. This is the newer one that we had not shared with the board previously, so I'm glad we could spend a little time talking about that one. On the next category is the water. This is the last category as well that we're going to talk about today. So just giving you a time check. Is the water reuse options. We have 4. One is The first one is about the recycled water purple pipe expansion, Peacock Gap and San Quentin. They're relatively small in terms of their yields, but there's quite a bit of pipe involved. Those are ongoing programs that are being studied right now. The second one is indirect potable reuse. So looking at advanced treatment and conveyance of that purified water to Kent Lake. When that water would be discharged into Kent Lake, it could either be stored for water supply or could help support the environmental releases from Kent. And then we had two DPR options that were identified. One is using the CMSA, the Central Marine Sanitation Agency, treating that water and doing raw water augmentation, where that would be delivered to Bontempi Lake, or treated water augmentation, which would be discharged or added to the distribution system directly. And then kind of an expansion of that raw water one is where you could look at CMSA, but also combine with Las Colinas and SASM, South Marin, and discharge that to Bontempi Lake. The number 4 is a large, roughly 7 MGD capacity. The CMSA one is roughly 4 MGD capacity, and the IPR opportunity is essentially a 7 MGD capacity as well. So that's the yield numbers are basically the capacity of those potential. Our team has looked at kind of low flow characteristics and said, what is the size of the plant and the yield given the low flows that we might be having. And then the recycled water expansion numbers, the Peacock Gap is the latest number from the ongoing study of 285 acre feet per year, San Quentin 150, and the costs are actually quite high at this point for the Peacock Gap. I know they're at 30% design, so some of those numbers may change, but fairly high cost estimates. The IPR program is again a 7 MGD that's been reduced at about 90% from its nameplate capacity to look at annual yield, and around $4,500 to $5,000 an acre foot. And then when you look at the two raw water augmentation or the treated water augmentation opportunities with the CMSA DPR aspect, the treated water augmentation ends up being a lower cost option, primarily because of the reduced conveyance. You don't need to discharge it all the way up to Bontempi Lake. You're putting it into the distribution system, so that has conveyance and pumping costs associated with it. And then finally, the regional DPR, which is looking at essentially 3 treatment plants using the wastewater treatment plants, effluent, treating that, and then delivering that to Bontempi Lake is a high cost capital option and fairly high cost per acre foot as well. I've worn you down sufficiently, I think. Okay, I want to move to the next piece of it. So we've kind of tried to lay all the cards on the table here. This is what we've been doing over the past month or so to refine some of these cost estimates. I appreciate the comments from all the board members, and we'll take a look at some refinements as we move forward. Where we're heading in the process, though, is taking all of those cards that are on the table and really doing an assessment of how well do each of the alternatives resolve system performance challenges during critical dry periods, because that's really the goal of this project, is how do we manage your critical dry periods. So how well do they manage reservoir storage above 30,000 acre feet? If you recall, a month or two ago, maybe 2 months ago, we talked about 30,000 acre feet as being a measuring stick at which we would want to keep storage above that level. And then reduce, how well do the alternatives reduce potential delivery shortages? So that's what we've identified as our performance criteria. And then the next block of it is about how do we look at alternatives that might have similar levels of performance. They maybe manage the storage and reduce the shortages in an equal fashion. How do we compare those alternatives? And that's what we're looking at, evaluation criteria. So we start applying subjective criteria onto them. And then we start to look at which ones perform better, what combinations of alternatives could be considered, and what portfolio strategies might be the most strategic to offer up for your consideration. So we have a slightly modified list of the evaluation criteria that we are starting to apply to each of the water management alternatives and the options. So what we've talked about today is essentially the cost aspects of them. That's one of the set of criteria, but not all of them. We want to look at timing, which we start to lay out exactly how long would it take for each one of these options to become operational and start producing either a demand reduction or a new supply yield. We've got timelines that we're building out. How reliable is that supply during a period of need? So right now we've kind of said they're all reliable in our assessment. That was kind of the foundation of it, but we know that's not true, and we're going to start to apply ratings associated with it. Environmental impacts. So do they have low or high or positive or negative or neutral environmental impacts? Feasibility of the option in terms of technical feasibility, the maturity of the concept, energy. We want to look at the energy footprint associated with each one of the options. And again, these will be evaluated on a scale that's kind of high, medium, low, a 5-point scale. So we'll be looking at kind of green, yellow, and red lights associated with each of these. Permitting and legal challenges. Certainly some of the options that are on the list here will have substantial permitting and legal challenges. We want to evaluate that. Social aspects, socioeconomic, do they have positive or negative socioeconomic impacts, or are they relatively neutral? And then the last one that we added that I think tends to be quite useful in a lot of these decision processes that we've been undertaking is, what is the complexity of the jurisdiction to implement? Is it something that Marin can do all by your own district? How many parties do you need to be involved? Is there federal, state, local parties? So I think the jurisdiction part might shed some light in terms of like the complexity, the political complexity or the implementation complexity of options. So we'd like to come back to you on the 27th meeting, I think it is, in 2 weeks' time, with an initial evaluation of all the options against these criteria.
But Armin, before you go forward, can
Yeah.
come back to a couple of these? When you're showing time, if there's a way to just show, if you could make it as a bar graph or something that's cumulative, because each of these, is a critical phase and doing planning, design, permitting, implementation. Just to be great to be able to see that broken out. You got to add it up anyway. Reliability does supply during dry periods, and can you speak to how climate change is factored into that dry year assessment?
Yeah, so I'll just use maybe the transfers as an example to talk about this. The reliability of accessing that supply might be quite challenged during the driest periods, whereas let's say the reliability of a reuse supply is quite reliable. We know we've got certain wastewater flows, we've got the minimum flow. So those you can compare and contrast those two. One is quite reliable in terms of the supply being available. One might be more challenging, but then you look at the other criteria and they might, one might have higher permitting or legal or aspects. So climate change will be assessed in terms of the availability of the supply kind of from a qualitative standpoint, or we'll use existing information.
Okay, I think that, as we're obviously trying to be climate prepared and adapt. And so I think, to some extent, I'm not sure if the way you described it will make it transparent to our customers how well something behaves in a climate, in a warming climate. So I don't know if that might even just be an evaluation criteria unto itself. I think it probably warrants it, and frankly, it might be helpful on a number of different levels. Can you, in terms of environmental, are we including carbon emissions and carbon footprint of the project?
So we would put that under the energy category, because we're converting energy use to essentially carbon footprint. So
Sure.
we could bring it into the environmental, but right now we build it under the energy.
Okay, as long as I think that's going to be a criteria, an evaluation criteria that we'll want to see. In terms of feasibility, feasibility is quite a wide range. Can you speak a little bit more about what you mean in this, at how you're evaluating the feasibility criteria?
Yeah, the feasibility will be a qualitative one, again, kind of 1 through 5 rating, looking at have these types of concepts already been delivered, projects already implemented, so they're technically quite feasible. Is there challenges with either the technology or the implementation of the project that might challenge the feasibility or the implementation of the project? So it's a technical aspect related to the implementation of the concept itself, whereas the permitting and legal are looking at challenges with respect to impacts and the like.
So let me give you, for instance, how would you capture the feasibility differences between implementing a project on land that we own versus a project that requires, infrastructure that, like any of the interties that requires going across other jurisdictions and so forth? Or how would that be captured as a feasibility factor? I think each of those nodes adds complexity and, challenges to feasibility.
Yeah, so the way we've treated this primarily in other projects is technical feasibility. So in that case, that criteria wouldn't discern too much from the 2 examples you just provided, but the jurisdiction then would highlight significant differences. So you had a project on land you own, so your jurisdiction would be primarily Marin, versus a transfer program where now your jurisdiction is say Yuba County Water Agency, the state board, the Delta party. So your jurisdiction web gets quite a bit larger there.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you.
Does it make any sense to break our evaluation up into categories rather than do the detail you're talking about on every one of these issues? Break them up into a pool. Some that will do less superficial, we'll do a more superficial analysis and able to discard it, so that we shrink the size of the pool that we do the detailed analysis on, just for efficiency, if nothing else. I mean, we could spend the rest of our life not getting there on this approach.
Yeah, it's a very good comment, Director Gibson. What we typically do on all of these is there's a quick screen. So just from the knowledge of the project, we can get fairly quickly to the A, B, C, D, or 1 through 5 rating of them. It's only the ones that are quantitative where we're actually investing quite a bit more time, like doing an actual energy analysis, or the permitting side, I think, has to be done regardless. So that's why we think we can come back in a couple of weeks' time. So this is not going to be an overly burdensome process, but I think it will start to shed light on the differences of the options, in addition to the cost and yield numbers.
Okay.
Okay, well, that's just getting to our next steps. We're taking all of these options many of them have already been built into the decision support model. So we're now comparing them against the performance criteria. So we want to come back and show you actual storage plots with certain options on or different options on, so you can see the relative benefit of each of the alternatives. And then we'll have the evaluation criteria and initial scoring of them for each of the alternatives to share. And then lastly, we'd like to talk about how we're structuring or how we're proposing to structure portfolios and the roadmap strategy. So I think that will be a really useful conversation to have with the board, and so you can get a sense for how we're heading with that process and provide your input and see if there's any adjustments needed. But we're certainly thinking about multiple portfolios that would be tested, and each portfolio might lean towards a specific strategy that you're trying to achieve, either low cost, high reliability, low environmental footprint, et cetera. Okay, well, with that, this is our upcoming schedule, and maybe I'll hand it back to Paul if there's any closing comments you want to, if you're still with us, Paul.
Indeed, I am. Thanks, Armin. I don't have any more to add. I think we've been at it a couple of hours, and we can turn it over to the board for any questions that haven't been asked. And while you're maybe the board have had their questions, and I think the process would be to look for public comment at this point if the board agrees.
Yes, I think it's a good time.
Yeah, I'll just maybe just say at the outset, thank you folks so much for all the hard work that went into this. It's really thought-provoking, and it's the kind of information that we need. And so I hope all the questions don't convey that a lack of appreciation for the work you guys have done. So thank you.
Agree.
Mhm.
So we have several speakers. I just want to remind our public that you have 3 minutes to leave your comment. When you get to the 15-second left of your comment, the sound will go off to let you know to please wrap up your last comment, and then the bell will go off. So we have about 6 speakers right now. The first 3, Maria G., Roger Roberts, and Phil Sauter. So if I may please have Maria G. leave her comment.
Hello, thank you for taking my comments. I'm going to make this very brief because the building I'm in just had a pretty large earthquake in Santa Rosa. So I'm going to make it really, really quick. So my name is Maria Gasletta. I am one of the family members of the Barboni Ranch, and we would be heavily impacted by the raising of the Sula Hula, especially the 38 feet that has been proposed, at least at this time. Not only are we affected by it, but the Dalsini Ranch, Stevens, Papalias, Gambonini, Googans, and Hicks Valley ranches are also affected. Our ranch alone, numerous residences, all of our outstructures, barns, livestock facilities, miles of access roadways, and hundreds of acres of our low-lying pasture land for our livestock would be inundated. The Dalsini Ranch, the road which was built for them when the Sula Hula was built in order for them to access their property, would be underwater, as well as all of their structures, landlocking their entire parcel. I could go on and on, but I'm just going to leave it at that for right now. So there's only 2 other points I'm going to do, and then I'm going to head out. I was not forwarded the 2017 Water Resources Plan report until today, but I did look it over, and then I was also able to find the Stillwater Sciences report from 2018. And in that, I noticed that there was, on figure 6, a map with potential mines that are in the area. And I believe, if I'm looking at it correctly, if you were to elevate it 36 feet, those mines could potentially be underwater as well. So that's something to think about regarding to water quality. Other than that, I just want to make a point that the Sula Hula is solely fed by rainfall and watershed, and it is consistently inconsistent over the past few years. I know that my family, as well as the adjoining families, keep rainfall records. And last October, I walked miles from our end almost all the way to the levee. And I know you guys pumped part of it, but it was very, very dry. And the only thing that saved us were those late October rains. So thank you for hearing my comments. Sorry, I'm a little preoccupied, but I appreciate all the work. And we do want to, you know, make this a better situation. But I do have concerns, as well as many of our neighbors. And I know that at least for the ranches, if you do raise it up to 36 feet, you'll landlock thousands of acres of land. Not only will you destroy our homes and possibly some of our livelihoods, but we won't be able to access any of the land. So 4 of those ranches alone are thousands of acres. And I obviously have a stake in it because it's my homeland. So thank you all very much. And I'm going to get out of this building, but take care.
Thank you. Mr. Roger Roberts, please.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I don't need to press my bar, right? You can hear me without pressing my bar?
That's correct. You're good.
Okay, good. I'm really pleased to see at the final stages of this report that you were beginning to talk about evaluation and performance criteria and so on, because one of the things that's bothered me up until now is that there's been no risk assessments associated with the various options. And so this looks like you're going to attack that matter, and that I'm looking forward to that. I would like to emphasize the need to look for weak links in the reasoning associated with your final evaluation criteria, because there will be various aspects of each option that have certain weak links that need to be well understood. And my last comment is relative to surface storage and the inclusion of Devil's Gulch. That is a spawning site. You do not want to put a reservoir in a spawning site. And I think you need to recognize that. And I'm done.
Thank you. The next speaker is Phil Sauter, then Vice Mayor Chance Cutrano and Ed Jamison. Go ahead, Mr. Sauter.
Thank you. I've been to 4 or 5 of these 7 water supply meetings, and I very much appreciated the opportunity to watch the water supply options develop with input from staff, from the consultants, and from the board. All of the options have had 7 turns at bat, except conservation, which had its preliminary discussion tonight. And I've got some benefit already as we're beginning to realize that there are options with a large impact, like lawns and leaks, and options with a smaller impact. I was really grateful to see the yield and cost summary table for water conservation make its debut this evening. It gives us a chance to collaborate and enhance this approach as we have with all the other options and keep the integrated approach going. Over time, the most impactful conservation programs will float to the top, so to speak. As General Manager Hornstein and others suggested, my hunch for conservation projects is that 100 here and 100 there is not a very useful approach, whereas a couple good projects like 4,000 acre feet from outdoor watering and 2,000 acre feet from leaks are 2 good starting points, as they're significant, persistent, and most likely economical. Universal AMI or FLUME would be a good way to evaluate how the high impact programs are working, while also not losing sight of the ongoing lower impact programs that have brought us to where we are. I'm very glad there's a meeting with Madhouse next week and would like to thank staff for making that happen. One question, and it may be premature, is how will Madhouse be integrated into this process? Can they be asked to create a yield and cost summary for conservation, as Jacobs has done for the other alternatives? Or will staff do the integration and make the combined presentation to the board and to the public? If staff is meeting with them next week, perhaps Madhouse could get a look at the format we're using to compare options, including conservation. And equally important, I think, will be making sure that both Jacobs and Madhouse are encouraged to work collaboratively and understand that the district will be using a blend of options rather than an either-or approach. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Sauter. Vice Mayor Cutrano, please.
Yes, good evening all. Chance Catrano, Vice Mayor Town of Fairfax, but I'm speaking on behalf of myself this evening. Just want to give huge kudos again to Jacobs Engineering. Have been impressed with everything all the work products to date and the discussions to date. I'll probably submit more detailed comments in writing as things progress, but just a quick thing on the criteria. What's not clear to me is how do these criteria stack against each other? Is it all just based on like the board's sort of feeling about the different criteria, or is there a point-based system, or how does that end up working out? I think part of that rationale is, oftentimes there are a whole myriad of environmental or social or racial justice implications for these types of projects, both local and regional, or in the case of larger state projects, it's like statewide implications. And oftentimes we can collapse all of those different impacts down into a single sentence. Whereas it's obviously a lot easier, more black and white as far as cost of capital or cost of operation and management for a project. But just wanted to flag that. I think it would be really helpful to understand anticipated impacts of the natural environment. Like, what are all of the different impacts? Are we talking habitat? I know Armin mentioned where carbon emissions or embodied or embedded carbon in a project might fit in, and was thinking maybe that might be shelved under energy. When I think of energy, I think of more that we're trying to get to the point of what is the energy intensity of a project or the energy efficiency of a project, and trying to capture that with a metric like kilowatt hours or something like that, or megawatts. I'm really interested in how expansive those different criteria are, to give more nuance, not only to the board of directors and staff as you all move through this, but also to the public, so we can better assist you all in providing direction and guidance. So thank you all very much for being here. This is it's a pleasure to participate in this process. Take care.
Thank you. Mr. Jameson, please.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Thanks. Slide number 20 on intertie options does not note that the intertie to East Bay Mud could only be used in declared emergencies, and that East Bay Mud's adopted principles restrict such water to indoor use and firefighting only, ensuring that such use of such a pipeline would require that much or most of Marin's landscaping be killed. This option is only a desperate last act measure if we find ourselves in a potential disaster like we faced early last fall. Unlike the other three pipeline alternatives, East Bay Mud is not a viable option for a reliable source of water. And I'm perplexed that the estimated cost of a 5 MGD desal plant is about $250 million, more than twice the $110 million cost of Antioch's 20% larger plant, and double Dohany's estimated cost for the same size plant, and about twice last fall's estimate, excluding a 30% contingency. And if we need a desal pretreatment plant and Antioch doesn't, how much are you assuming a pretreatment plant would cost? These desal cost numbers just don't pass the sniff test when compared to Antioch and Doheny. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you. The next speaker is Carol D., Clayton Smith, and Barbara Reedy. Go ahead, Miss Carol D.
Thank you. My name is Carol Dalcini, and I want to thank Director Kohler for reading portions of a letter that I sent to all the members of the board. And this is specifically regarding the Sule Hule issue. I also want to thank you for providing this forum for public input into such an important issue. I want to acknowledge that planning for water supply resiliency in this time of shifting and unpredictable climate patterns is a very complex process. I'm a member of a rural Marin family whose property is located on the current boundary of the Sule Hule Reservoir, and I wish to reiterate grave concern about the proposal which involves raising the existing Sule Hule Dam by 30 feet. As was already read into the record, this particular option would lead to expanding the boundaries of the reservoir to such an extent that our family home, all of our outbuildings, our access road, and a large portion of open pasture land would be completely inundated. This inundated would adversely affect not only our family, but our livelihood, and it would impact those of neighboring ranchers as well, as you heard from Maria Gisletta. What I would like to say to the board is that we in Hicks Valley, we share the common goal with the larger Marin community of preserving open space and supporting sustainable agriculture. Our interest is to work with Marin Municipal Board to find achievable solutions that can augment Marin's water supply without causing harm to the communities. And by that, I mean families and businesses that border the Sulihule Reservoir. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Mr. Clayton Smith, please.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Good. First off, I'd like to know how many people are actually online today watching this. I know you have the facility, if you would choose to put the number of participants at this meeting or make it available in the toolbar, but I don't see it there. I was at a Board of Education meeting today, Board of Supervisors, recently at the City Council of Mill Valley. They're all meeting in person. And I think this would be a very important thing to add to the ingredient here for public participation. I'd like to see if you might choose to have in-person meetings to follow this, particularly since you're coming, it appears, almost to the conclusion of this process. And still, I'm almost certain hardly anyone in the county really knows what's going on here, which is disturbing to me. And I think it also would, I hope that this, what you're talking about, these summaries are going to be presented in a hard copy form somewhere, or at least in a downloadable, printable form, not just in this, the verbal form. I found that following the voice of the presenter was very difficult. It's very monotonal. And this kind of detail presented in such a monotonal manner is very, very difficult to stay with, particularly given how so much of it is filled with very technical terms. The other question I'd also like to raise is we keep on hearing this stuff about global warming. And I recognize we've had a hot spell here briefly for a week or so. And I'd like to know what studies you're relying upon, what long-term studies of temperature and weather you're actually using to make these pronouncements, what substantiates this concern. The idea of variations in precipitation is one thing, but this endless talk about climate warming and it being the responsible element, and also the carbon issue, the carbon input for developing any of these programs. Any technological large-scale construction project will be carbon intensive, but I'd like us to discount it as an emergency concern. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. Miss Barbara Reedy. Hello.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. My name is Barbara Reedy, and the sister of that Eloquent Carol who spoke earlier. And I will be equally impacted as she mentioned. I was looking back over the history of the region, and I see that pretty much since the 60s, every 20 or 30 years, a dam is built or raised to the detriment of the ranching community. So what I would like to suggest is to move forward a large dam raising option, the names on the table, and I hope it is not. I would recommend possibly that you actively include members of the ranching community in conversation This would be a departure from what we have experienced in the past and a positive move. We are intelligent as people who recognize seriousness of the situation for which you are very carefully trying to find a solution. And it is just possible we may have a point of view or vision which could lead to compromise and less devastation of lives, land, and personal. I am cognizant of the care you appear to be taking as you move forward in the United States. That is all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Reedy. The next speaker we have is Larry Minikis.
Yes, good evening, and I'd like to thank Armin and Paul and Jim and the people at Jacobs for the presentation tonight, and especially for the additional information on the slide deck. That's exceptionally helpful. I want to agree with Roger Roberts on the importance of risk assessment, and I think the comments we're hearing tonight, both from the board and from the public, are really excellent and have raised a lot of the realities of what we can look at, what is viable, what may not be viable at all. And looking at jurisdiction is very much the discussion that has been going on with the public comments you're getting tonight about Sulahuli. You know, that will fall under there. And that's how we'll start to winnow out some of these. It's great that everything's in front of us. There's no criticism for showing the full palette. That's what we want to see. But as we can hear from the public, some things are just better left alone. And this falls with the Delta also. This will fall under jurisdiction. It's good that we're having this discussion. But once we get into jurisdiction, once we get into risk assessment, we're going to learn a heck of a lot more. And so with that, I want to thank you very much and good evening.
Thank you, Mr. Minikis. I have no more further speakers.
You going to finish this, Paul?
I was going to turn it over to you, President Russell. It's a special board meeting.
Okay, well, that's cool. I just like to thank everyone and the public for their comments. I hope people are starting to see the complexity of this kind of an approach. There's a lot of options, which is good. It's just hard to assess some of them because it's hard to know exactly what it is until you get a little more data. And then, you know, these are severe engineering questions that need a thorough engineering review before we can jump one way or the other. With all that, thank you, Armin, and your gang. You've done this well, and we appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you all. Appreciate it.
Okay, I'm going to adjourn the meeting.
Everybody, good night.
Thank you, folks.
Okay.
All right.
Thanks.
Night, everybody.
Bye.